last week I had an interview for a magazine, not an architecture magazine, and it's about the general public, so to say. And then you get a typical question like, what are your ideals? And I was like, wow, what to say? I wasn't really prepared for that question. And then I said, yeah, but then maybe there is an ideal. Maybe there was the ideal of this book in the 90s, which we did almost 20 years ago, when we started our office, and indeed this the times of Datascape. But it was also about using space in an efficient way. Be very aware of when you build something, it's very difficult to kind of erase it again. Yeah, you can demolish it, but then there's always a street or a sewage line or whatever. So in the Dutch context, we have always something around us. We don't have emptiness at all. So this was a kind of unconscious driving force to go against it, to try to make a more efficient, a more dense use of space, and it's sort of a responsibility that we still have, so that you have the expanding cities. It went berserk, so to say, in the last 20 years. So if you add something, let's be at least conscious about it. And we thought about all this information put together once in a super graph that had the graph that had all graphs inside it. And you can see indeed the big trends in there. More people, less resources. So these were some old images. You can see that on the computer graphics of these days. The next chapter, which kind of moved it into a more kind of catalog of ideas and principles, was this book, where we thought to analyze our work and to find certain prototypes, certain directions. So we don't have to invent everything again all the time, but you can say, okay, which base type are we using, and how can we continue with that? So we have had a certain series of tools, maybe, like to span or to bridge or to stack. And out of this, out of this collection of our works, we sort of made our own dictionary, say, catalog of these. So we ordered the designs we made in the past. So the stack chapter was one of the chapters in the book, for instance, and one of the projects in the stack chapter was, for instance, the Dutch Pavilion in Hannover, which again was a kind of representation of the idea, how can you build differently in the Netherlands, which was for us an incredible chance to show that how the future could look like, so that we shouldn't expand horizontally but vertically. And from the simple model, it went to the reality, and the diagram is almost the same as the rendering, and the rendering is almost the same as the finished result. And for us, after making the book, we said, okay, what are we now doing as architects? And sometimes it's not easy to describe, but we had a word, and I think it was interesting that in the description of Ralph and Ilka about working with space, that we are also working with space. So it's not writing about space, making books about space. We are also dealing with space in the broadest sense of the word. So we don't visualize, we're not 2D, we are 3D visualizing, we're like spatializers. We think in a spatial way. That was a word, a kind of a verb as well. To spatialize is something you could do. To architect is something which is really strange. You can sculpt, you can write, but you cannot architect, which is always an interesting thing. What do architects actually do? So what do they do? We made a series of words describing the design process, and it looks quite general, but this is a sort of basic recipe for how a design process could look like. You analyze, you summarize, you distill, you define, you test, you explore, you compare, you select, you develop, you compose, and you present. Then, done. So I go quickly along these 10 I think there are more or less 10 steps, to give a bit of background, what it could mean, and trying to grasp the design process.
Now, this is an art that is crazily public. It's 100% public. There's no private sphere at all. Why do I talk about this? I talk about this because we live in a condition in which art is entirely private. It's entirely made from a subjective point of view. Of course, this has to deal with romanticism in between, liberal subjectivity, whatsoever. The point is, contemporary art is not at all dealing with the public sphere in any sort of manner. The only artistic practice is somehow still dealing with the public is architecture. And And this is purely, I think, residual. It's the product of, I think, two things. Architecture didn't got rid entirely, although plenty of idiots try their best to get rid as much as possible of its disciplinary status. And second, it still deals with something that is public, like a school is a public building. It's undeniable. The kids of different people go to that school. Also, in the context of neoliberalism and in the time frame imposed by neoliberalism to our lives, architecture is one of the few practices that still consider a long time frame. As much as there's been plenty of, let's say, debate on temporary cities, since futurism, Sant'Elia was speaking of cities that might appear and disappear. This is simply not true at all. Once you build something, then it has a lot of inertia, it stays there for a lot of time, it takes quite long to build it, and architecture is, by chance, by pure circumstance, still forced to deal with the long-term time frame. Something that nobody is dealing with anymore. It's not politicians, not anybody, maybe a couple of philosophers, some writers, I don't know, Derek Walcott is doing that. But for the rest, this thing's been completely removed from our collective horizon. So I think architecture is nowadays particularly interesting when it deals with these, that is being ignored by anything else. That also creates a very strange position, because architecture has been, that is by definition, the, how to say, uncritical art. Because you do architecture with the money of the power, you have to deal with the king or the tyrant or whatsoever sort of democracy, has acquired this strangely critical power that's totally also unwanted, I think, because it still hints at some sort of future beyond the 15-year of investment of whatsoever business plan. Now, we try to do this. Of course, this implies also a different definition of who the architect is. So we are a practice of 6 partners plus some employees, and we try to avoid as much as possible an authorial approach to architecture, in the sense that we are 6, we need to discuss a lot in order to produce what we produce. The only difference with what Jacob van Rijs was saying before is that we don't do hypotheses. We just do one hypothesis, then it fails, then we do the other one. But nevertheless, we are forced to a lot of waste of useless work because we have to agree with each other. So there's a huge amount of discussion inside the office to produce architecture. So we see a model much more into this kind of collective authorship experimented in several offices like the one I'm quickly passing by, more than this type of romantic hero figure that is very strikingly depicted in the movie The Fountainhead. And starting from this, what we try to do is an architecture that is as abstract as possible.
We are located in Brussels, which is today known as Molenbeek. In this picture you see the office on the 3rd floor, but you also see the urban environment we are in, and also the type of Europe we are becoming. So a Europe that is increasingly complex, hybrid, many people migrating, creating situations which are, on the one hand, the result of a lot of infrastructure, a lot of investment, giving this kind of urbanized delta. I think if you go from Holland to Belgium, you can hardly know where the one stops and the other one starts, except for maybe the signs and a certain sense of cleanliness that might be higher in one country than in the other. But nevertheless, there's a kind of large inherited urban environment. And we think it's very interesting as an architect to work in that environment, with that environment, and to see our role really as trying to manipulate that environment rather than just adding buildings to it. So architecture and building is really like a tool that you can use to change this environment, but also to address the complexity that you saw on the image before. And in that sense, we really started out as an architect's office, but now we have grown into a company that calls its mission statement that we envision the transformations in society through the production of space. And I think it's interesting to see the role of architecture as this kind of instrument that can do more than just deliver buildings in a functional or maybe inspiring way, but to really think about the environment and how you can change that. And so on this picture you can see a range of things colliding, converging. I took today 2 examples. Our production is very diverse, so it's very difficult to talk through examples, but I chose these 2 examples because they say something about how we design, how we work, and what we think you can do with it. We call ourselves an international office, but obviously international can mean a lot of things, and for us it basically means that we work in the region around Brussels, which goes into the Netherlands, which goes into the north of France. We work in France itself, which is at least the contexts where we come into France are very procedural. France is a country produced by modernism, and it's extremely different from the improvised attitude or the attitude of improvisation that you find in Brussels. So the mentality switch between these 2 countries couldn't be bigger. And then we also have a history in Albania since 2004, a country which is inside the European Union physically, but outside of it mentally, historically, and which basically is a country which is a developing country. You find services in Albania that you also find in Tanzania. For instance, they have a mobile banking system which is called M-Pesa, and Pesa means money in Swahili. And so the fact that you find these services in Albania says a lot about the type of country it is. What is interesting about Albania is that it's an extremely entrepreneurial society. A society that had a brutal transition in the 90s. And what was for us very interesting to come there and work was that we were confronted with a society that was highly ambitious, highly dynamic, completely looking for what it could be, but basically only finding itself with obstacles in realizing those ambitions. So Albania, in that sense, became for us a kind of life experiment in how to deal with tensions, how to deal with obstacles, and not to see them as something that blocks a process, but to see them as opportunities in a process, to see every obstacle as a way to find new opportunities, to reroute your path, and to make things better.
One could say that before we even start anything, we pose the question of what materials can do for us. Material agency is the precondition of spatiality and formal possibilities. Consider, if you will, what skins are associated with in architecture as a sheathing, but also consider the way in which corrugation is rigid, structurally rigid on one axis, and malleable on the other. And by being so, it gains you the possibility of actually unwinding itself on that axis while being totally rigid on the other to produce an awning, a space within the skin that connects the living room level, in this case, to the garden. Now, it's more important in the context of this conference also is this idea that in architecture, drawing is not an illustrative act. Quite the opposite. Drawing is always already an act of construction. In this sense, everybody who understands construction knows that if that line at the top is the same length as the line at the bottom, by virtue of the straight lines that connect them, then this is a ruled surface. And by making a ruled geometry, it's a developable surface and therefore fabricatable. In other words, the proof is really in the drawing itself, which becomes the basis for the model and subsequently the building. As a seamless project, as a surface that appears to be essentially atectonic, you do not see the panelization here, we're also reminded that architecture, more often than not, is composed of units. You look at the ceiling, you look at almost any element within a building, and it's unitized. And so the problem of aggregation is really at the core of much of what we do. And this talk in great part is about the tension that we produce in our own discipline between figural processes and configurative processes. These effectively are the same thing, the bowl, the nest, the same figure, if you like. But if you think of this as a cast concrete, a polished concrete bowl, then the evidence of its construction is polished out. The aggregate that is, in fact, unique in all of its different pieces are erased out of its construction, whereas the nest articulates the very increments, the twigs from which it is fabricated. To that end, when we were thinking of Casa La Roca, a direct extension of the first house I just showed, the idea of transforming a load-bearing wall to a curtain wall became a kind of natural way in which to rethink masonry construction. Here, in the mindset of Leverance, we didn't want to cut any brick. We simply wanted to fold it along the diagonal axis. And then by corbelling the brick step by step, we were able effectively to give it the lateral bracing that is needed for a wall such as this. Now, this is also nothing completely new either. You've all seen the serpentine walls of Virginia. You've known the walls of Eladio d'Este. In this case, however, the advent of a new bonding system, what I call the variable bonding system, ensures that light and air are also embedded into this structural system.
Architecture is always political. Just ask Gottfried Semper. In every project, no matter its scale, there are different power relationships, there are different constituencies, sometimes surprising coalitions, and in the end, there are winners and losers. As architects, we'll have to pick sides if we don't want them to be picked for us. I want to show you, actually I want to start out with showing one project that is about, actually let me say a couple of words about what I mean by design as research and design as activism before. So design as research means not only designing the research tools and visualizations, but is also the first and most crucial step of a project, in that it helps us as architects to understand the specific role, the limitations, and sometimes the surprising possibilities of design vis-a-vis the different actors and forces in a given situation. It helps us define the causes and clients we want to work for. Design as activism then is about devising the tools to do the work, namely to influence outcomes, broadly speaking, influence outcomes in the built environment. These tools can include drawings and plans, but also installations, writing, and advocacy. For us, design is inherently disciplinary, but that interdisciplinarity is a means, not an end. A lot of our design work is actually, or research design work, is about cities, but more importantly about how people transform cities, often through everyday practices. For example, I want to show you a very old project of ours. One is dealing with Detroit. comes out of the Shrinking Cities project. I saw Philip here before. So it's a project dealing with Detroit, a city that has been the perpetual target of proposals to save the city in decline, through heroic architecture and planning schemes. The latest iteration of that is on display in Venice at the moment. But simply by hanging out and doing ethnographic research in the city, we found another unnoticed and decidedly unheroic approach to urban redevelopment, namely the fact that people who were left behind in the shrinking city were expanding their territory by buying or borrowing land adjacent to their homes, making what we called blots. We thought it's actually interesting to see that there are people who are taking advantage of their city's shrinkage, quietly changing the ownership structure of their city through these self-interested practices, at a time when the spectacular architectural narrative about Detroit was that of ruins, never really mentioning those people who were left in place. So we did this kind of, one could say, ethnographic research, on-the-ground research, going on the one hand through cadastral maps and property records, finding that this phenomenon of blotting happened on a massive scale in the city, all over Detroit, and that it actually radically, even though it was small scale change, it actually radically changed the ownership structure of the city, its parcel pattern. Here, for example, you see the Misik family that owns an entire block of the city. So there are many, many of these blots, and many different types of blots. Satellite dish blots here, trampoline blots, carport blots, this blot of somebody who wanted to park perpendicular to his house. There are fantasy blots, like this one with the silver fence. There's the courtyard blot, like this one, where one family, the Toral family, over a couple of years, really transformed, expanded their territory, and thereby also transformed the typology of Detroit architecture. Or this one, the garden blot, where the Andrin family, over decades, basically bought up 6 of these parcels, putting a fence around it, and making this kind of compound. This here is an aerial photo of what they did on the coffee table of their Andorans. So they're rather proud of what they did. But beyond that individual pride, there was no awareness, organization, or community of these blotters. There wasn't even a name for what they were doing. So what does design have to do with it? Here, in this case, our work as designers was what Frick just called making urban reality drawings, right? So, and thereby working as ghostwriters, right? Ghostwriters, naming, drawing, visualizing practices of people who, like celebrities, were just too busy talking about what they're good at.